Hi everyone, welcome to this week's online module. Wanted to provide a video, kind of me talking through our PowerPoint this week. Feel free to look at the PowerPoint on your own, or if this helps, I'll be talking through it with you. I will also have the quiz available that goes with the PowerPoint on Canvas. You'll have to take it through there. But this week's kind of a review. We're going to be talking about variables and problems and really how Hoy explained and gave lots of examples of variables as he walked through a lot of different concepts and ideas. But where I wanted to start out with is getting that idea from a concept to a variable. And I really wanted to emphasize the part that Hoy talks about on page 25 where he says there is no substitute for a comprehensive review of the literature to get a good fix on the idea that you're interested in studying. And in talking with doctoral students over and over again as to what should I study, or how do we do this, or how should I define that, really you have to dig into the literature. The best way to look for identifying concepts, especially getting them to the variable point, is getting into the literature and knowing the literature backwards and forwards. Really, in identifying a variable in the concept 2 study, it's really the focus of the researcher. And so many different researchers define concepts and ideas differently. You really join a camp, and if you remember from our last meeting where you put in your or and you take a side and someone aligns them with you or challenges you, really you identify the definition that you want to work with or that really resonates with you and understanding it. So moving from that concept and that construct, they're really abstract ideas. They're latent terms, and we have to come up with a way to describe them or measure them and identify them. And the idea of a construct versus a concept is kind of alluded to in the chapter. Concepts tends to be components or parts, and constructs are larger ideas that are made up of concepts. And they're all abstract in idea, but the researcher really identifies the specific definition of them. The concept then becomes a variable when you measure it, when you come up with a way to identify and measure it. You operationalize that definition. And so in the text, and Hoy talks about this, and many others identify as this constitutive or conceptual or theoretical or different ways of identifying the variable, but then we come up with an operationalized definition of it, and that's where we measure it and where it becomes measured. One other thing I wanted to point out is this idea of validity. When we take a concept and we then measure it, we need to ensure that the variable that we're measuring really truly identifies that concept. That's that issue of validity, or that it's a valid measure of that concept. And so we need to ensure as researchers that we choose the best way to measure the concept we're attempting to define or attempt to understand with the definition we're using in hand. And we'll come back to validity more. We'll talk more about it as we go farther in the class. So I wanted to pause here, and I'll give you a minute. You can pause the video and stop, but I want you to take a second, write down what is your understanding of what a variable is before we jump into it. So what's your understanding? How would you define it? Take a minute now, hit pause, and write that down. Okay, so in coming back, let's break variable into the different components. So in identifying a variable, we have to identify our object and what is our unit of analysis. And so really it's picking out what we want to study, who we want to study, a place, a thing, an event, and the way that this object differs from each other. So let's talk student. The way the student differs from another student. Eye color, hair color, ability, literacy, fluency, math ability. Those are different ways that these objects differ from each other. And these objects have properties, or they have attributes about them that describe that object. And that object can be explained many different ways. As a student can be explained many different ways. So within that object there's properties. And those properties are essentially those variables. And when you associate a value to it, then it becomes a variable. So if we say a DIBEL score of a student, that is a property of that student in describing that student, the DIBEL score. That's an associated value. An SES status, socioeconomic status, that is a property of that student. And so there are categories within those properties that help us identify high SES, low SES, blue eyes, brown eyes. But when that variable, when is the variable constant, is when there is only one property of that variable. And so in the literature, or in the text, it referred to a constant is when there's no way to measure it in a different way, so it's not mutually exclusive and it's not exhaustive, then it's a constant. So the values of the property is the number that represents either the magnitude or the category. So if we take that property and we affix a value to it, we can give a DIBEL score, which could be a quantitative measure, or a categorical, which would be the blue eyes, brown eyes, blonde hair, brown hair, height, tall, short. But we have to have at least two categories for it to be a variable. And then what's a variable with one category? Just talked about it. It's a constant. So this idea of exhaustive and mutually exclusive, an exhaustive category would be one where we can affix a value to it. And then mutually exclusive is that it only can have one value affixed to it. We can't both be high SES and low SES. It can be one or the other. But we have to have a way to measure it, and it has to have only one value. That's the mutually exclusive and the exhaustive. Another way of identifying that variable and the property is it can be called categorical or continuous. And so one of the other literature sources that Hoy's talking about, Charters, calls it in kind, as for categorical, and then continuous is by degree. But categorical typically is qualitative in measure, and continuous is quantitative in measure, as from a relationship 0 to 100, and categorical being obvious as in categories. So you can pause here and go take the quiz, or you can take it after, but I want you to describe the variables in these following relationships. So what are the variables here? Are they continuous or categorical? So the first one, the correlation between carrot consumption and eye health. Second one, the amount of time spent reading per day and fluency, number of discipline referrals and the years of teaching, school climate, and the leadership style of the principal. So go to the quiz and answer what are the variables, and are they continuous or categorical. So moving on, in talking about variables, there needs to be, in a quantitative measure, an independent and a dependent variable. And as with everything else, we learn different terms, and I learned explanatory variable is synonymous with independent variable. But the independent variable is what the researcher studies to see its relationship or its effect. So it's this idea of possible cause, or the presumed cause, that could be explaining the relationship. It's independent of the outcome. It's explaining the relationship. The dependent variable, or what I learned is the response variable, is what is being influenced or affected by that independent variable. It's the results. It's the outcome. So the dependent responds to the explanatory variable as it's influencing it. So the independent variable may either be manipulated or measured. As described by Hoy, the idea of a manipulated variable really only occurs in the experimental research. But it's changed by the researcher, and they create those conditions, and they change the study. The measured variable is a variable that already exists, but can be measured. And oftentimes it's the non-experimental type of research. It's a known entity or data that you access. But a manipulated variable really only occurs in a true experimental study. So back to our quiz again. Let's identify the independent and dependent variables in these relationships that we were asking questions before. So you'll have to go back to the quiz and answer in the relationships here which one's the independent and dependent variable. Another concept that was brought up in the reading was this idea of a mediating and a moderating variable. It's also called, the mediating is also called an intervening variable. So the mediating variable really is a variable, and here's the definition. This is from a 1986 study, but it's really stood the test of time. It's been around a long time. But in general, a given variable may be said to function as a mediator to the extent that it accounts for the relation between the predictor and the criterion. Mediators explain how the external physical events take on an internal psychological significance, whereas moderator variables specify when certain effects will hold. Mediators speak to how or why such effects occur. So let's explain that. So here you'll see a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. The mediator variable attempts to explain that relationship. So let's take the idea of a principal being the independent variable and school success as the dependent variable. The mediator variable there would be teachers. Teachers explain that relationship. The principal cannot go in and teach all of the students and raise test scores or the success of the school, although there's other factors that influence it. But teachers are that mediating variable. So a moderator variable, in general terms, it can be a qualitative or quantitative variable that affects the direction or the strength of the relationship, an independent or predictor variable, and a dependent or criterion variable. So specifically within a correlation analysis framework, a moderator is the third variable that affects the zero-order correlation between two other variables. So essentially, in this model, you can see that stress can lead to depression. But there can be a moderator variable that can reduce the amount of depression. And so social support, the amount of social support given, can increase or decrease that depression from an individual that has stress. So another way to think about these two issues is the moderator really influences the strength of the relationship. And the mediator is one that explains the relationship. So in my background being a science teacher, think of a catalyst. The catalyst can speed up that reaction time for two components. Moderator really influences the strength of that relationship, but it's not essential. It doesn't have to be there. That a relationship can occur without it. The mediator one explains the relationship between two other variables. So we've talked about variables, let's talk about problems. And really, as researchers, we've got to identify our problems first before we determine our variables. And the book doesn't really talk about this. This comes from another book called Craft of Research. But it talks about a pain. Identifying a pain really will help identify what our problem is. And so I wanted to walk through my example of some of the research that I've done. But I was assisting and directing a Principals Academy at BYU for about 3 years, and this Principals Academy was the sole purpose of bringing PLCs into schools, so training principals into bringing cultural change in their schools and bringing about PLCs. So we were having principals come up to us after they'd gone through the program asking us, well, how do I know if I'm successful? How do I know if I'm implementing PLCs well? How do I see if this is successful or not? So there we were seeing a pain that these principals were struggling as to knowing whether they were successfully implementing PLCs in their schools, professional learning communities. There's multiple aspects of that problem. It could have been, the success of their teachers, could have been the success of the principal. But the one that I identified as the problem here in that pain was that we had to be able to measure our implementation of PLCs. There was no way of knowing whether we were implementing the PLCs other than anecdotally. So we needed to measure. But before we could measure PLCs, we need to know a definition of a PLC. And in the literature, there was lots of different definitions of PLCs. And so before I could come up with a measurement, we had to identify first what the definition of a professional learning community was and what are the component aspects or characteristics of it were. Then we could then build the measurement. And so we created a survey that measured according to that definition, thereby addressing that pain of providing principals with a quantitative scale of implementation or the culture of their school according to PLCs. So we selected one aspect of that problem even though we could have picked multiple aspects, picked one aspect of that problem and focus on it and ask the question of it. And so my questions were what is the definition of a professional learning community, and how do we measure it? And so hopefully that gives you some help in identifying a problem, as this next week you'll need to go through Research Design Sheet 1, which will help you identify and flesh out your problem that you would like to address for your final data problem or your data assessment project. Hopefully this was helpful, and again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call.